The evening air in Lisbon smells of salt and sawdust as shipwrights put the finishing touches on the largest vessel Portugal has ever built. The year is 1502, and the massive carrack taking shape in the royal shipyards represents everything the Portuguese Empire hopes to become. At 400 tons, she dwarfs every other ship in the harbour, her hull painted in the royal colours, her name carved proudly into her stern Flor de la Mar, flower of the sea. The shipbuilders work by torchlight, their hammers ringing against iron fittings as they secure the final planks of a hull that stretches nearly twice the length of any Portuguese vessel that has come before. This is more than just a ship. It is a statement of national ambition, a floating symbol of Portugal's determination to dominate the lucrative spice trade that connects Europe to the riches of the East. Every nail driven into her massive timbers represents an investment in a future where Portuguese flags fly over trading posts from Goa to Macau. Tonight, you will follow this magnificent ship through 9 years of triumph and disaster, from the spice markets of Malacca to her final moments in a Sumatran storm. But more importantly, you will uncover one of history's greatest maritime mysteries. Did the treasure that made Flor de la Mar legendary really sink with the ship, or is the entire story built on a 500-year-old lie? This is not just the tale of a lost treasure worth billions in today's currency. This is the story of how legends are born, how historical truth becomes profitable fiction, and why sometimes the most valuable thing about a mystery is not its solution, but the questions it forces us to ask about the difference between what we want to believe and what actually happened. Let your breathing settle as we sail back through 5 centuries to witness the birth, life, and death of a ship that became more famous for what she carried than for what she accomplished. In the waters off Sumatra, where monsoon storms still rage and currents run strong enough to break apart the mightiest vessels. The truth about Flor de la Mar waits to be discovered. The story begins with the best of intentions and the worst possible design flaws. From her very first voyage, Flor de la Mar revealed herself to be a beautiful disaster waiting to happen. The Portuguese had built a giant, but as you will learn, giants are often more fragile than they appear, and the bigger they are, the more catastrophic their fall becomes. The shipwrights hammering her final planks into place in that Lisbon evening could never have imagined that their masterpiece would become history's most profitable shipwreck, worth more as a legend than she ever was as a working vessel. But first, she had to prove herself on the most dangerous trade route in the world. The Portuguese Empire in 1502 stood at a crossroads that would determine its future for centuries. Vasco da Gama had opened the sea route to India just 4 years earlier, proving that European ships could reach the source of the spice trade that had enriched Venice and other Mediterranean powers for generations. But those early voyages had also revealed the limitations of traditional Portuguese ship design. The small caravels that had served well for coastal exploration and short Atlantic crossings were simply inadequate for the demands of regular trade. With India, the round trip to India took nearly 2 years and covered over 20,000 miles through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. Ships had to survive Atlantic storms, navigate around the treacherous Cape of Good Hope, cross the vast Indian Ocean, and then return fully loaded with precious cargo that represented the entire profit from the voyage. A single lost ship could bankrupt the investors who financed these expeditions. The Portuguese solution was characteristically ambitious: build bigger ships. If small vessels couldn't carry enough cargo to make the India trade profitable, they would construct enormous carracks capable of transporting vast quantities of spices. Flor de la Mar was the culmination of this philosophy. A vessel designed to revolutionize Portuguese maritime commerce through sheer scale. But scale brings its own problems, as the Portuguese were about to discover. The engineering principles that worked perfectly for smaller ships didn't necessarily apply to vessels the size of Flor de la Mar. The stresses on a 400-ton ship were exponentially greater than those affecting a 100-ton caravel, and 16th century shipbuilders didn't fully understand the mathematics of structural engineering that would become crucial for large vessel construction. The Portuguese were essentially conducting an experiment in the limits of wooden ship construction, using the most valuable trade route in the world as their testing ground. Flor de la Mar was their hypothesis about what was possible, and the Indian Ocean would be their laboratory for proving or disproving their theories about maritime engineering. The ship's maiden voyage in 1502 under Estevão da Gama initially seemed to vindicate Portuguese confidence in their new approach to shipbuilding. The outbound journey to India proceeded without major incident, and Flor de la Mar proved she could handle the open ocean when her holds were relatively empty and her weight properly distributed. The Portuguese began to believe they had solved the fundamental problem of long-distance trade, how to carry enough cargo to make the dangerous journey profitable. But the real test would come on the return voyage, when every available space would be packed with the precious spices that justified the entire enterprise. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and cardamom worth more than their weight in silver would fill her holds, transforming her from a majestic sailing vessel into a floating treasury that represented Portugal's hopes for commercial dominance in the East. When Flor de la Mar left Indian waters in 1503, fully loaded with spices, she immediately began exhibiting the problems that would plague her for the rest of her brief career. The enormous weight of her cargo made her sit low in the water and respond sluggishly to steering commands. More troubling still, she began taking on water almost as soon as she was fully loaded, suggesting that her hull was flexing and opening seams under the stress of maximum cargo. The first major crisis came in the Mozambique Channel, that narrow passage between Madagascar and the African mainland where currents run strong and weather can change with deadly speed. This stretch of water had already claimed several Portuguese vessels, and it would prove to be Flor de la Mar's nemesis throughout her career. As the overladen ship struggled against the powerful currents that characterized the channel, her structural problems became impossible to ignore. Water poured through opened seams faster than the crew could pump it out. The massive weight of her cargo was literally pulling her apart, and Esteban da Gama faced the choice between continuing toward home in almost certain disaster, or putting into Mozambique Island for emergency repairs. Contemporary witness Tomé Lopes recorded the details of what followed, providing crucial evidence about Flor de la Mar's fundamental design flaws. The ship was beached at Mozambique Island and essentially rebuilt from the water lineup. What should have been a brief stop for water and supplies turned into a 2-month ordeal as Portuguese shipwrights struggled to reinforce a hull that had never been designed to carry such enormous loads. The repairs required stripping much of her cargo to access the damaged areas. Revealing the extent of the structural failure, planks had separated along their entire length, allowing seawater to pour into spaces that should have been watertight. The frame members that were supposed to hold the hull together had cracked under stress, creating a cascade of failures throughout the ship's structure. Most revealing of all was the discovery that these problems weren't caused by battle damage, collision, or any external force. Flor de la Mar was being destroyed by her own cargo, torn apart by the very spices she'd been built to carry. The Portuguese had created a ship that could sail to India beautifully, but couldn't safely return with the cargo that made the journey worthwhile. Lopes's account makes clear that this wasn't just bad luck or poor seamanship. The Portuguese were confronting a fundamental engineering failure that threatened the entire basis of their expansion into the Indian Ocean. They had built their flower of the sea to be impressive rather than practical, and the ocean was teaching them the brutal difference between ambition and reality. The 2 months spent repairing Flor de la Mar at Mozambique Island should have been a warning that the ship's design was fundamentally flawed. Any rational analysis would have concluded that she was unsuitable for regular service on the India route, and should be either extensively redesigned or retired from active duty. The cost of the emergency repairs alone exceeded the profit from several successful trading voyages, but the Portuguese were not thinking rationally. The potential profits from the India trade were simply too enormous to let one problematic return journey discourage their expansion plans. More importantly, too much money and prestige had already been invested in Flor de la Mar to admit that she was a failure. The ship that was supposed to represent Portuguese maritime supremacy had become a symbol of national pride that couldn't be abandoned without severe political consequences. When Flor de la Mar finally limped back to Lisbon in 1503, she should have been retired or completely rebuilt. Instead, she was immediately prepared for another voyage. The Portuguese had made the decision that would ultimately doom her rather than acknowledge their engineering failure. They would pretend it was an anomaly and continue risking lives and treasure on a ship they knew to be dangerous. The second voyage under João de Nova in 1505 proved conclusively that the first disaster had been anything but an anomaly. Once again, Flor de la Mar made the outbound journey to India without serious problems. Once again, loading her with spices for the return trip transformed her from a majestic vessel into a floating liability, and once again, the Mozambique Channel nearly claimed her entirely. This time, the problems were even worse than before. The emergency repairs conducted at Mozambique Island in 1503 had been stopgap measures rather than fundamental solutions. The underlying structural weaknesses remained, and they reasserted themselves with a vengeance as soon as the ship was fully loaded again. Instead of 2 months of repairs, Flor de la Mar was stranded for nearly 10 months, from late 1506 well into 1507. The ship that was supposed to make regular profitable voyages to India had become the Portuguese Empire's most expensive and dangerous liability. Every voyage risked not just the loss of the ship herself, but the loss of cargo valuable enough to finance entire military campaigns. The extended stay in the Mozambique Channel provided ample opportunity for Portuguese officials to study Flor de la Mar's problems in detail. Naval architects examined her hull, analysed the stress patterns that caused repeated failures, and developed detailed understanding of why she couldn't safely carry maximum cargo. Yet still they persisted in trying to use her for the very purpose that was destroying her. This persistence reveals something important about the psychology of imperial expansion in the early 16th century. The Portuguese were operating so close to the limits of their resources that acknowledging major failures was simply not an option. They had committed everything to their eastern expansion, and success was the only acceptable outcome regardless of the costs or risks involved. The Portuguese had also fallen victim to a cognitive trap that would plague maritime empires for centuries, the sunk cost fallacy. So much money had already been invested in Flor de la Mar that abandoning her felt like admitting total failure. It seemed more rational to continue investing in repairs and modifications than to write off the entire project, even though objective analysis showed she would never be safe for regular service. During this second extended stay at Mozambique Island, Portuguese officials made the decision that would seal Flor de la Mar's fate. Instead of sending her home for retirement or complete reconstruction, they decided to incorporate her permanently into the Indian Ocean fleet. The ship that couldn't safely carry cargo would be converted into a warship, serving the military campaigns that were establishing Portuguese dominance throughout the region. This decision appeared to solve multiple problems simultaneously. It removed Flor de la Mar from a cargo-carrying role where she was dangerous and unreliable. It provided Portuguese commanders with the largest and most imposing vessel in their fleet, useful for intimidating enemies and serving as a flagship. Most importantly, it allowed the Portuguese to maintain face by keeping their problematic ship in active service, rather than admitting she was a failure. When Tristão da Cunha's fleet rescued Flor de la Mar from the Mozambique Channel in 1507, they were saving more than just a ship. They were preserving Portuguese prestige and the viability of their entire eastern strategy. But they were also setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to her ultimate destruction. From 1507 onward, Flor de la Mar never returned to Portugal. Instead, she became the flagship for the most aggressive and successful phase of Portuguese expansion in the Indian Ocean. Under the command of Afonso de Albuquerque, she would participate in military campaigns that established Portuguese control over strategic choke points from the Red Sea to the Strait of Malacca. The transformation from failed merchant vessel to successful warship seemed to vindicate the Portuguese decision to keep Flor de la Mar in service. Her enormous size, which had been a liability when trying to navigate currents while fully loaded with spices, became a decisive advantage when intimidating enemy ports or serving as a platform for artillery bombardment. The psychological impact of Flor de la Mar's appearance in hostile harbours cannot be underestimated. Local rulers who had never seen European vessels were confronted with a ship larger than many buildings in their cities, bristling with cannon and flying the Portuguese flag as a symbol of European technological superiority. The mere sight of her was often enough to convince enemies that resistance was futile. Under Albuquerque's command, Flor de la Mar participated in the conquest of Socotra, a strategic island at the mouth of the Red Sea that gave Portugal control over one of the most important trade routes connecting the Indian Ocean to Europe. The capture of this island demonstrated that Portuguese naval power could project force throughout the region, threatening established Muslim trading networks that had operated without European interference for centuries. She helped capture the cities of Curiati, Muscat, and Corfacan on the Arabian Peninsula, establishing Portuguese control over crucial ports that controlled access to the Persian Gulf. Each victory reinforced Portuguese dominance and demonstrated the effectiveness of European naval technology against traditional Middle Eastern fortifications. Most significantly, Flor de la Mar served as flagship during the conquest of Ormuz in 1507, giving Portugal control over the entrance to the Persian Gulf and access to some of the richest trade routes in the world. The capture of Ormuz was a strategic masterstroke that allowed Portugal to dominate trade between India and Persia, while collecting tribute from merchants who had no choice but to use Portuguese-controlled ports. The success of these military campaigns seemed to prove that the Portuguese had found the right role for their problematic ship. Flor de la Mar's size and intimidating appearance made her perfect for establishing Portuguese dominance. while her structural problems were less relevant for military operations that didn't require her to carry maximum cargo loads over long distances. In 1509, Flor de la Mar achieved her greatest military triumph as flagship during the Battle of Diu, one of the most decisive naval engagements in Indian Ocean history. The Portuguese fleet, commanded by Francisco de Almeida with Flor de la Mar as his flagship, faced a combined Egyptian, Turkish, and Indian fleet in waters off the Indian coast. The battle was crucial for Portuguese survival in the east. Their enemies had assembled the largest naval force ever directed against European presence in the Indian Ocean, with ships carrying the latest Ottoman military technology and crews experienced in Mediterranean warfare. If the Portuguese lost this battle, their entire Eastern Empire would collapse within months. Flor de la Mar's role in the Portuguese victory was both practical and symbolic. Her heavy artillery provided the firepower that broke enemy formations, while her imposing presence served as a rallying point for Portuguese forces throughout the battle. The victory at Diu established Portuguese naval supremacy in the Indian Ocean for generations and marked the beginning of European dominance over Asian maritime trade. The ship that had been a failure as a cargo vessel had become a symbol of Portuguese military might. Her transformation seemed to justify all the resources invested in her construction and repair, proving that even flawed engineering could serve useful purposes if properly applied. But success in war created new temptations that would ultimately prove more dangerous than the original design flaws. As Flor de la Mar participated in more conquests and accumulated more treasure from captured cities, she was gradually transformed from a warship back into a cargo vessel, but now carrying cargo far more valuable and dangerous than spices. Portuguese military success in the Indian Ocean generated enormous quantities of plunder, gold ornaments from conquered palaces, precious gems from royal treasuries, elaborate artifacts crafted from materials European artisans had never seen before. All of this wealth needed to be transported back to Portugal as proof of Portuguese success and justification for continued investment in Eastern expansion. Flor de la Mar became a repository for this accumulated treasure, her holds gradually filling with the most valuable objects the Portuguese had captured during their campaigns. Her role evolved from flagship to floating treasury, and this concentration of wealth in a ship already known to have structural problems was creating conditions for disaster. The final chapter of Flor de la Mar's story began with Portugal's greatest triumph in the East, the conquest of Malacca in 1511. This bustling port city was one of the richest trading centres in the world, a place where merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Europe came to exchange goods worth fortunes. Whoever controlled Malacca could dominate trade throughout Southeast Asia. The city's wealth was legendary even by the standards of the Indian Ocean trade. Chinese silk arrived by the shipload, exchanged for Indian spices or Arabian incense, and European manufactured goods. The Sultan of Malacca had accumulated treasure that surpassed the royal collections of most European kingdoms, while the city's wealthy merchants maintained private hoards that would have impressed Portuguese nobles. When Albuquerque's forces stormed Malacca's defences in August 1511, they gained access to wealth that exceeded their wildest dreams. The conquest of the Sultan's palace alone yielded plunder described by contemporary sources as breathtaking. Gold ornaments, precious stones, elaborate jewellery, silk tapestries worth their weight in silver, and ceremonial objects crafted from materials most Portuguese had never seen before. The systematic looting of Malacca took weeks to complete. Portuguese soldiers searched every wealthy residence, confiscated the contents of merchant warehouses, and stripped ornaments from temples and palaces. The total value of the plunder was so enormous that contemporary chroniclers struggled to find adequate words to describe it. To the wealth taken from Malacca was added a massive tribute payment from the King of Siam, who hoped to secure Portuguese friendship through generous gifts. This tribute included ornate palanquins covered in gold leaf, ceremonial weapons encrusted with gems, and artistic objects that demonstrated the sophisticated craftsmanship of Southeast Asian artisans. Albuquerque himself had accumulated a substantial personal fortune during his years commanding Portuguese forces in the East. As the architect of Portuguese expansion, he had been entitled to a share of every conquest, and his private collection of treasure had grown to rival royal collections. He decided that the conquest of Malacca provided the perfect opportunity to return to Portugal as a hero, bearing gifts worthy of a king. The decision to load all of this wealth onto a single ship for the triumphant journey home was driven by psychological rather than practical considerations. Albuquerque understood the dramatic impact of arriving in Lisbon with one vessel loaded with incredible treasure. The sight of Flor de la Mar's holds packed with the wealth of the East would provide powerful visual proof of Portuguese success and justification for continued investment in Eastern expansion. But the decision also revealed dangerous overconfidence about Flor de la Mar's capabilities. Albuquerque was choosing to ignore everything he knew about the ship's structural problems, betting that her recent success as a warship had somehow solved the fundamental design flaws that had plagued her throughout her career. The choice of Flor de la Mar for this crucial mission was made purely on the basis of cargo capacity. She was the largest ship in the Portuguese fleet, capable of carrying more treasure than any other vessel, but size was exactly the quality that had made her dangerous when fully loaded, and Albuquerque was about to test her limits more severely than ever before. The loading of Flor de la Mar in late 1511 must have been an impressive sight. Chest after chest of treasure was carried aboard while crowds of Portuguese soldiers and local onlookers watched in amazement. Bronze lions that adorned the Sultan's palace, elaborately decorated palanquins that had carried Southeast Asian royalty, chests filled with precious stones that sparkled in the tropical sunlight, rolls of silk worth fortunes, and ceremonial weapons that represented centuries of artistic tradition. As the cargo accumulated, Flor de la Mar began exhibiting familiar warning signs. The massive weight made her settle deeper into the water, reducing her freeboard and making her more vulnerable to heavy seas. Her response to steering became sluggish and unpredictable, requiring more effort from her crew to maintain course. Most troubling of all, she began showing signs of the structural stress that had nearly sunk her twice before in the Mozambique Channel. Seams opened slightly under the weight of the treasure, requiring constant pumping to keep water out of the holds. The ship's frame creaked and groaned as it flexed under stresses it had never been designed to handle. Any experienced mariner examining Flor de la Mar would have recognized these as symptoms of impending structural failure. But Albuquerque was not thinking like an experienced mariner. He was thinking like a conquistador who had spent years accumulating this treasure and wanted to present it to his king as a single, overwhelming demonstration of Portuguese achievement in the East. The psychological impact of arriving in Lisbon with one ship loaded with incredible wealth would be far greater than distributing the same treasure among several vessels. The rational decision would have been to divide the cargo among multiple ships, reducing the risk to any single vessel and ensuring that some treasure would survive even if one ship was lost. But rationality was not driving Portuguese decision-making in 1511. Pride, ambition, and the desire for dramatic effect were more important than maritime safety. So in November 1511, Flor de la Mar departed Malacca, carrying what contemporary sources described as the single most valuable cargo ever loaded onto a European ship. The exact value of this treasure has been estimated by modern sources at figures ranging from $2 to $3 billion in today's currency, though these calculations are based on rough contemporary descriptions rather than precise inventories. Whether these enormous valuations are accurate or not, there was no question that Albuquerque was risking a fortune that represented years of Portuguese conquest and plunder. He was betting everything the Portuguese had gained in the East on a ship with a proven track record of structural failure when fully loaded. The small fleet that departed Malacca in late 1511 represented the pinnacle of Portuguese achievement in the East. Led by Flor de la Mar with her cargo of incredible treasure, they embodied Portuguese hopes for continued expansion and the wealth that would finance future conquests. But they were also carrying the seeds of disaster in the form of a ship that had already demonstrated her inability to handle maximum loads safely. The voyage began deceptively well. Flor de la Mar, despite her heavy load and the warning signs she had already shown, managed to navigate the relatively calm waters around Malacca without serious incident. The early stages of the journey may have convinced Albuquerque that his gamble was paying off, and that his ship could handle her precious cargo. But the Portuguese were gambling with more than just their ship and cargo. They were risking the entire foundation of their Eastern Empire on a vessel they knew to be fundamentally flawed. The decision to use Flor de la Mar for this crucial mission reveals something important about Portuguese imperial psychology in the early 16th century. This was an empire built on audacious gambles, on the willingness to risk everything for the chance of unprecedented rewards. The same mentality that had driven Portuguese explorers to attempt the first sea route to India, to challenge established Muslim trading networks with tiny fleets, and to assault fortified cities with forces that seemed inadequate for the task, now led them to load their most valuable cargo onto their most problematic ship. The Portuguese had succeeded in the east precisely because they were willing to take risks that more cautious powers would have avoided. Their entire strategy depended on bold moves that maximised potential rewards, even when they also maximised potential losses. Flor de la Mar's final voyage was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. As the fleet headed into the Strait of Malacca, they encountered the monsoon weather patterns that make these waters among the most dangerous in the world. The strait, barely 40 miles wide at its narrowest point, funnels wind and current into a natural wind tunnel that can transform calm seas into deadly maelstroms within hours. Local sailors had developed sophisticated techniques for navigating these waters safely. They timed their passages to avoid the worst weather, used shallow draft vessels that could ride out storms that would destroy larger ships, and maintained detailed knowledge of currents, winds, and seasonal patterns that allowed them to work with natural forces rather than against them. But the Portuguese, despite nearly a decade of experience in the Indian Ocean, had never fully adapted their European shipbuilding traditions to local conditions. Flor de la Mar represented everything problematic about this approach. She was a European design scaled up beyond safe limits, carrying a European concept of cargo loading that ignored the realities of monsoon sailing. The Portuguese had conquered the Indian Ocean through superior firepower and tactical aggression, but they had never truly learned to live with its natural rhythms and dangers. They imposed European solutions on Asian problems, often successfully, but always at the cost of increased risk and vulnerability to natural forces beyond their control. For an overladen ship with known structural weaknesses, the Strait of Malacca in monsoon season was essentially a death sentence waiting to be carried out. The combination of Flor de la Mar's design flaws, her dangerous cargo load, and the notorious weather conditions in the strait created a perfect storm of factors that made disaster almost inevitable. On the night of November 20th, 1511, near Cape Timea, in the waters controlled by the Aru Kingdom of Sumatra, all these factors converged in catastrophic fashion. The storm that struck Flor de la Mar was severe but not extraordinary by the standards of the region. Contemporary accounts describe it as a typical monsoon tempest, with high winds and heavy seas that local sailors would have considered dangerous but not necessarily fatal. But for a ship already stressed beyond her design limits, it was more than enough. Flor de la Mar had been held together by Portuguese determination and emergency repairs for nearly a decade. The structural problems that had plagued her throughout her career, temporarily masked by her success as a lightly loaded warship, reasserted themselves with catastrophic results when she was once again asked to carry maximum cargo. The weight of the treasure cargo had strained her hull beyond the breaking point, opening seams and stressing frame members past their limits. The storm's waves completed the work that poor design and overloading had begun years earlier. Flor de la Mar began breaking apart almost immediately, her hull splitting along stress lines that had been developing since her first voyage to India. The ship broke in two during the night, and more than 400 sailors died in the wreck along with their dreams of wealth and glory. The treasure that was supposed to have financed Portuguese expansion for years instead sank beneath the waves, creating one of history's most famous maritime disasters. It should have been the end of the story, a tragic but straightforward tale of greed and poor judgment leading to predictable disaster. The Portuguese had ignored obvious warning signs, overloaded a ship they knew to be dangerous, and suffered the consequences of their reckless gambling. But the story of Flor de la Mar's treasure was just beginning. Afonso de Albuquerque survived the wreck through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of determination that had made him one of the most effective Portuguese commanders in the East, along with a handful of other survivors, including remarkably a young girl who was the daughter of a slave. He managed to reach safety on a makeshift raft constructed from pieces of the broken ship. This survival was crucial to everything that followed, because Albuquerque lived to tell what happened next, and his account reveals details that completely change our understanding of the Flor de la Mar treasure mystery. According to multiple contemporary sources, including the detailed chronicle of João de Barros, Albuquerque didn't simply escape from the wreck and continue on his way to safety. Instead, he returned to the site where Flor de la Mar had gone down and organised a systematic salvage operation. This decision makes perfect sense when you consider the crucial detail that most modern accounts of the story overlook. The ship didn't sink in the deep ocean water that modern treasure hunters imagine. Flor de la Mar broke apart and sank in relatively shallow water near the Sumatran coast. Multiple contemporary accounts specifically state that the ship drifted onto a beach before breaking up completely, which would have left the wreckage accessible to 16th century salvage techniques. The wreck site was in water shallow enough for experienced divers to reach, not the deep ocean grave that later legends would describe. Albuquerque was nothing if not practical. Faced with the loss of treasure worth years of Portuguese conquest, he immediately began organising efforts to recover what could be saved. He hired local divers, probably experienced pearl and sponge divers familiar with the dangerous waters around Sumatra, to descend to the wreck and systematically recover the most valuable and portable items. This salvage operation appears to have been remarkably successful, at least by the standards of 16th century technology. Contemporary Portuguese sources, which have been largely ignored by modern treasure hunting accounts, state clearly that most of the treasure was recovered by surviving Portuguese sailors in the weeks following the wreck. If these historical accounts are accurate, they completely transform our understanding of the Flor de la Mar mystery. The treasure that modern hunters are seeking may not exist in any meaningful sense, because it was recovered 5 centuries ago by the same Portuguese who lost it in the first place. The billions of dollars worth of gold, gems, and artifacts that supposedly lie on the ocean floor may have been salvaged, transported, and sold shortly after the wreck occurred. This possibility explains several puzzling aspects of the modern search for Flor de la Mar's treasure. Despite decades of searching by well-funded treasure hunting expeditions using sophisticated underwater detection equipment, no one has found definitive evidence of the massive treasure hoard that the legend describes. The most famous of these modern expeditions was led by American treasure hunter Robert Marks, who claimed in 1992 to have located the wreck after just 3 days of searching. Using side-scan sonar and other advanced technologies, Marks's announcement generated enormous excitement in the treasure hunting community and attracted international media attention. But Marks's project was mysteriously halted shortly after his initial announcement, allegedly due to information leaks that compromised the security of the operation. The official explanation never quite made sense from a practical standpoint. If Marks had actually found billions of dollars worth of treasure, why would information leaks prevent him from recovering it? Surely the potential profits would justify increased security measures rather than abandoning the entire project. The more logical explanation may be that Marks found the wreck site, but discovered it had already been stripped of its valuable cargo centuries earlier. A 16th century salvage operation would have focused on the most valuable and portable items, leaving behind only the ship's structure and any cargo too heavy or bulky to recover easily. This scenario would explain both Marks's apparent success in locating the wreck and his subsequent abandonment of the project. Finding a stripped wreck site would provide historical confirmation of Flor de la Mar's location without offering the kind of treasure recovery opportunities that make expensive salvage operations economically viable. The environmental challenges facing any salvage operation in the area where Flor de la Mar sank are formidable, and help explain why the wreck site might have remained undisturbed for so long despite its legendary status. The waters off Sumatra are notorious for conditions that make underwater work extremely difficult and dangerous. Visibility in these waters is essentially zero due to sediment stirred up by powerful currents and regular storms. The seabed consists of soft mud that can shift dramatically with each monsoon season, potentially burying or exposing wreck sites unpredictably. Strong and unpredictable currents make it difficult to maintain position over a specific location, while the constant threat of sudden weather changes creates additional safety hazards for diving operations. These same environmental conditions that make modern salvage operations so challenging would have affected any treasure that remained on the wreck site for 5 centuries. Organic materials like silk textiles, wooden artifacts, and leather goods would have deteriorated completely within decades of submersion. Even precious metals and gems would have been scattered by currents, buried by shifting sediment, or corroded by the aggressive marine environment. More importantly, these natural forces would have gradually broken up and dispersed any remaining wreckage, making it increasingly difficult to locate and identify specific sites. The Flor de la Mar that modern treasure hunters are seeking may no longer exist as a coherent wreck site, but rather as scattered debris spread across miles of muddy seabed. But the environmental challenges pale in comparison to the legal obstacles that have effectively protected whatever remains of Flor de la Mar from commercial salvage operations. 3 different nations, Portugal, Indonesia and Malaysia, each claim legal rights to any treasure that might be found, and their competing claims have created a legal maze that no commercial operation has been willing to navigate. Portugal's claim rests on the well-established principle of international maritime law that warships remain the property of their nation of origin, regardless of how much time has passed since they were lost. Flor de la Mar was a Portuguese naval vessel serving the Portuguese crown when she sank, and Portuguese authorities argue that this gives them permanent ownership rights over the ship and her contents. This principle has been upheld in numerous international legal cases involving more recent warships, and there is no statute of limitations that would extinguish Portuguese rights simply because 5 centuries have passed. From Portugal's perspective, any treasure recovered from Flor de la Mar would be stolen Portuguese property, and they would pursue legal action against anyone attempting unauthorized salvage operations. Indonesia's claim is based on territorial sovereignty and their domestic laws governing underwater cultural heritage. Since the wreck lies within Indonesian territorial waters, Indonesian authorities argue that they have jurisdiction over anything found on their seabed. Indonesia has specific legislation that allows the government to auction recovered artifacts, with proceeds going to the Indonesian state rather than to foreign treasure hunters. Indonesian officials have made it clear that they would consider any unauthorized salvage operation to be theft of Indonesian cultural patrimony, regardless of the ship's original nationality. They point to the fact that the treasure was largely plundered from Asian sources in the first place, making its return to Asian control a matter of historical justice. Malaysia's claim is perhaps the most complex, based on cultural heritage rights, and the argument that much of the treasure was originally taken from Malacca, which is now part of Malaysia. Malaysian authorities argue that the artifacts should be considered stolen cultural property that should be returned to their place of origin, much like art treasures looted during wartime are returned to their countries of origin when discovered decades later. From Malaysia's perspective, Flor de la Mar was carrying the cultural heritage of the Malay people, stolen during Portuguese conquest and colonization. Any recovery operation should prioritise the return of these artifacts to Malaysian museums and cultural institutions rather than their sale to private collectors or foreign governments. None of these 3 nations has shown any inclination to negotiate a compromise or joint salvage agreement. Each has too much at stake politically to appear to compromise their sovereignty or cultural rights. The result is a 3-way legal deadlock that has made it virtually impossible for any private treasure hunting operation to proceed with confidence that they could retain ownership of anything they might find. This legal paralysis has created an unintentional but highly effective protection for whatever remains of the Flor de la Mar site. Commercial treasure hunters, who might otherwise have the resources and motivation to conduct thorough searches of the area, are deterred by the virtual certainty that any discovery would result in years of expensive international litigation with highly uncertain outcomes. The 3-way territorial dispute has accomplished what no formal archaeological preservation program could have achieved. It has made the site economically unattractive to commercial exploitation, while maintaining international attention and scholarly interest in its historical significance. But this legal protection may be safeguarding something that no longer exists in any meaningful form. If the historical accounts of successful 16th century salvage operations are accurate, then the legal battle is over treasure that was recovered and dispersed centuries ago. The modern billion-dollar valuations that make Flor de la Mar seem like such an attractive target may be based more on marketing and wishful thinking than on historical evidence or archaeological reality. The figures commonly cited for the treasure's current value, ranging from $2 to $3 billion in various popular accounts, represent a fascinating example of how historical legends adapt to contemporary economic concepts. These enormous valuations don't appear in any 16th century sources, which describe the treasure in terms of contemporary Portuguese currency and trade goods rather than absolute values. Modern treasure hunters and documentary producers have created these billion-dollar estimates by applying current precious metal and gemstone prices to rough contemporary descriptions of the cargo's contents. These calculations assume that all the treasure remained on the wreck, that it survived 5 centuries underwater without deterioration, and that it could be recovered and sold at full market value in today's economy. Each of these assumptions is highly questionable when examined closely. The historical evidence strongly suggests that much of the treasure was recovered shortly after the wreck occurred. 500 years of submersion in aggressive marine conditions would have destroyed or severely damaged many of the most valuable items, and the international legal disputes would make it virtually impossible to sell any recovered artifacts openly, drastically reducing their practical value regardless of their theoretical worth. More fundamentally, the billion-dollar valuations reflect a modern obsession with translating historical events into contemporary economic terms that may not be meaningful or accurate. The treasure carried by Flor de la Mar was valuable in 1511 because it represented Portuguese success in establishing trading relationships and extracting wealth from conquered territories. Its significance was political and strategic as much as purely economic. Attempting to calculate its modern value by multiplying estimated weights of gold and silver by current market prices ignores the historical context that gave the treasure its original importance. It also creates inflated expectations that make serious archaeological investigation more difficult by attracting treasure hunters focused on profit rather than historical understanding. The mythology surrounding Flor de la Mar's treasure has become more economically valuable than any actual treasure could possibly be. The legend generates documentaries, books, tourism revenue, and continued investment in search operations that create jobs and stimulate economic activity, regardless of whether they find anything. This modern treasure industry has created a vested interest in maintaining the mystery rather than solving it. Documentary producers, tour operators, and treasure hunting companies all benefit more from the ongoing search than they would from a definitive conclusion that the treasure no longer exists. The legend has become a renewable resource that generates value indefinitely, while any actual treasure could only be sold once. This transformation from historical artifact to modern commodity reveals something important about how we relate to the past in contemporary culture. Instead of trying to understand historical events in their own context, we often project our current desires and economic systems onto past events, creating myths that serve our present needs rather than illuminating historical truth. Flor de la Mar has become a case study in how modern treasure hunting has changed our relationship with maritime archaeology. Instead of focusing on what shipwrecks can teach us about historical trade networks, shipbuilding technology, and cultural exchange, we often concentrate on their potential monetary value in contemporary markets. This approach treats historical shipwrecks as resources to be exploited rather than cultural heritage sites to be studied and preserved. It prioritizes the recovery of valuable objects over the careful documentation and analysis that could provide insights into past societies and their maritime activities. The replica of Flor de la Mar displayed at the Maritime Museum in Malacca represents a more constructive approach to preserving and interpreting maritime heritage. Rather than seeking to exploit the ship's legendary treasure for commercial gain, the museum presents her story as part of the complex history of cultural interaction, technological development, and colonial expansion in Southeast Asia. The museum's exhibit acknowledges both the Portuguese achievements represented by Flor de la Mar's construction and voyages, and the cultural costs of Portuguese expansion that included the looting of local treasures and the disruption of established trading relationships. This balanced approach provides visitors with a more complete understanding of the historical period and its lasting consequences. The museum replica also serves as a tangible connection to an age of maritime exploration and technological innovation that shaped global trade. Patterns for centuries, visitors can appreciate the ship's impressive size and sophisticated construction, while learning about the engineering challenges that ultimately doomed her to structural failure. Most importantly, the museum approach treats Flor de la Mar as what she actually was, a significant historical vessel that played an important role in the development of global maritime trade networks and colonial relationships. The focus is on understanding the past rather than exploiting it, on education rather than treasure hunting, on preservation of cultural memory rather than extraction of economic value. This perspective recognizes that the real treasure carried by Flor de la Mar was not the gold and gems that filled her holds, but the knowledge she represents about human ambition, technological innovation, and the complex consequences of cultural contact between different civilizations. The ship's documented role in Portuguese imperial expansion provides insights into how European powers learned to project force across vast oceanic distances, with all the technological achievements and human costs that such expansion entailed. Her repeated structural failures illustrate the gap between ambition and engineering capability that characterized much of the age of exploration. Her final voyage, loaded with treasure from conquered territories, represents both the extraordinary wealth that motivated European expansion and the hubris that often accompanied such success. The decision to risk everything on a ship known to be fundamentally flawed reveals something essential about the psychology of imperial conquest and the dangers of overconfidence. The mystery surrounding her treasure may never be definitively resolved, but perhaps that ambiguity is more valuable than any definitive answer could be. Historical mysteries serve important cultural functions by encouraging ongoing investigation, maintaining public interest in the past, and reminding us that our knowledge of historical events is always incomplete and subject to revision. The contradictory evidence about what happened to Flor de la Mar's treasure, some sources claiming it was lost forever, others indicating it was largely recovered, reflects the fragmentary nature of historical records and the challenges of reconstructing events that occurred centuries ago, rather than seeing this contradiction as a problem to be solved. We might view it as a reminder of the complexity and uncertainty that characterize most historical questions. The ongoing search for Flor de la Mar's treasure, whether by professional archaeologists or amateur treasure hunters, keeps the ship's story alive in public consciousness and continues to generate new research that adds to our understanding of 16th century maritime history. Even unsuccessful searches contribute to our knowledge by eliminating possibilities and refining our understanding of the environmental and legal challenges involved in underwater archaeology. The legal disputes between Portugal, Indonesia, and Malaysia over ownership rights to any potential treasure also illuminate important contemporary issues about cultural heritage, colonial history, and international law. These debates force us to consider difficult questions about who owns the past and how the legacy of historical conquest should be addressed into modern legal frameworks. As you settle into the quiet rhythms of approaching sleep, consider that the most enduring treasures are often not physical objects but the stories we tell about them and the questions they inspire us to ask. The Portuguese sailors who built Flor de la Mar, who sailed her across dangerous seas, who loaded her with the wealth of conquered territories and watched her break apart in a Sumatran storm, left behind something more precious than any cargo of gold and gems. They left as a reminder that human ambition and human limitations are inextricably connected, that our greatest technological achievements often reveal new vulnerabilities, and that the pursuit of wealth and power carries costs that may not become apparent until it is too late to avoid paying them. The flower of the sea bloomed briefly and magnificently, carrying Portuguese dreams of empire across the Indian Ocean before sinking beneath waves that have kept her secrets for 5 centuries. Whether those secrets include vast treasure troves or simply the scattered remains of a ship that was more famous for her cargo than her, seaworthiness may matter less than the fact that we continue to wonder about her fate. In that wondering, in the questions her story raises about engineering and ambition, about treasure and loss, about the relationship between historical fact and profitable legend, Flor de la Mar continues to sail through our collective imagination, carrying a cargo more valuable than any material treasure, the enduring human fascination with mystery, adventure, and the eternal hope that somewhere beneath the dark waters of the world, answers to our deepest questions about triumph and failure await discovery. The truth about her treasure may lie not in any Indonesian waters or legal archives, but in the recognition that some stories become more valuable as mysteries than they ever could be as solved puzzles. In preserving her enigma, we preserve something essential about the human relationship with the past, our need to believe that history still holds surprises, that the ocean still guards secrets, and that the age of discovery, in all its glory and tragedy, continues wherever human curiosity meets the vast unknown.